A lonely road stretches toward distant mountains beneath a sky of iron and snow, where old ruins sleep beneath the frozen winds of the north. Welcome, friends. I'm John, and tonight we journey once more into Middle-earth, into an age when the shadow of Sauron lengthened across forgotten lands, and ancient fires stirred beneath the roots of stone. The world is quiet now, but not for long. Draw close to the hearth and let the tale begin. The wind came down from the northern mountains with the smell of snow and old stone upon it, bitter enough to sting the eyes and crack the skin of weary travelers. Hallis pulled his grey cloak tighter around his shoulders as he guided his horse along the narrow trail that wound beneath the hills of Forodwaith. The animal's breath steamed in the darkness, and every hoofbeat rang sharply against frozen earth before vanishing into the vast silence beyond the ridges. No birds called in that country. No running water could be heard beneath the sheets of ice that covered the streams. There was only the endless moaning of the wind and the distant groan of shifting glaciers somewhere high among the black peaks. Hallis had ridden alone for 6 days, and the loneliness of that northern waste had begun to settle into his bones like a sickness. Twilight faded slowly beneath clouds the color of iron, and the last pale light revealed the broken remains of an ancient watchtower standing upon a ridge ahead. Its upper half had collapsed long ago, leaving jagged stones exposed like shattered teeth against the darkening sky. Hallis reined in his horse and studied the ruin carefully, his gloved hand resting upon the hilt of his sword. Rangers of the north had once kept hidden paths and lonely outposts in these lands during the long years after the fall of Arnor. Yet this tower was older than that. Much older. He could see it in the shape of the stonework and the strange black mortar between the rocks. The place carried the shadow of another age, one that the old songs spoke of only in fragments beside winter fires. His horse snorted uneasily, stamping at the frozen ground, and Hallis felt the same unease stirring quietly in his own chest. He dismounted beside the ruin and tied the reins loosely to a cracked pillar half buried in snow. The cold struck harder once he stood still, creeping through leather and wool until his fingers ached beneath his gloves. Hallis drew a lantern from his saddlebag, shielding the flame with his palm while he lit it, and the sudden glow pushed back the darkness only a few paces around him. Beyond that small ring of light, the world remained black and watching. He climbed carefully through fallen stones into the heart of the ruined tower, where drifts of snow had gathered waist-deep against the walls. There, half hidden beneath frost and rubble, he found the body. The corpse lay twisted beside a broken stair, frozen hard as oakwood, its face buried beneath a rim of ice. Hallis knelt slowly, brushing snow from the dead man's shoulder until he saw the emblem stitched upon the torn cloak. A 7-pointed silver star gleamed faintly beneath the frost. One of the northern scouts from Lindon. The man could not have been dead more than 3 days. Hallis swallowed heavily and looked around the chamber again, this time with greater caution, for he knew now that he had not wandered upon forgotten ruins by chance. Someone else moved through these desolate lands, and not all of them still breathed. Near the corpse's stiffened hand lay a small leather map case, split open as though torn away during a struggle. Hallis reached for it carefully, and the dead man's frozen fingers cracked softly as they shifted aside. Inside the case, he found a single parchment marked with hurried charcoal lines and symbols. Most of it had been ruined by melted snow, but one detail remained clear enough to chill his blood. Deep within the mountains to the east, someone had drawn the sign of the lidless eye above a narrow valley, marked only with the old Sindarin word, Angruin. Fire of iron. Hallis stared at the mark in silence, while the lantern flame trembled in his hand. He had heard whispers in taverns along the Lune that servants of Sauron wandered far beyond Mordor now, seeking forgotten places and hidden weapons left buried after the wars of earlier ages. Most dismissed such tales as fear-mongering carried by merchants and frightened travelers. Yet here in the frozen dark, with a dead elf at his feet and the mark of the enemy before him, those stories no longer seemed distant or foolish. A sudden sound broke the silence beyond the tower walls. Not wind, footsteps. Hallis extinguished the lantern at once, and darkness swallowed the chamber whole. He crouched low behind a fallen slab of stone, while his hand slipped quietly to the hilt of his sword. Snow crunched outside the ruin, slow and deliberate, followed by the snort of horses. More than one. Hallis held his breath and listened as dim orange light flickered through cracks in the wall. Torches. Men speaking in a harsh eastern tongue drifted faintly through the night air, rough voices carrying laughter without warmth. Hallis knew enough of such speech to understand a few scattered words, and one of them struck him like a hammer blow. Forge. The strangers entered the outer court carelessly, stamping snow from their boots while torchlight rolled across the broken stones. Hallis counted 5 shadows moving beyond the collapsed archway. Easterlings by their armor and fur-lined cloaks, though not soldiers of any host he recognized. These men bore curved swords, blackened with soot, and each carried upon his neck a chain of red iron shaped like a burning eye. Hallis watched them from the darkness, while icy sweat gathered beneath his collar despite the cold. One of the men dragged another body behind him through the snow. Hallis saw pale hair trailing across the ground and knew there had been a second scout from Lindon. The Easterling tossed the corpse beside the wall and spat upon it before speaking to his companions in low, eager tones. "They searched too near the valley," said one in broken Westron, as he crouched beside the fire pit they began to build. The master warned that northern spies still wander. Another man laughed harshly while removing his gloves. "Let them wander. Soon there will be iron enough beneath the mountain to arm 10 kingdoms. Then even the elves will burn." Hallis listened carefully, forcing himself to remain still, though anger tightened every muscle in his body. He needed names, numbers, direction. Dead men offered little counsel, but living enemies often spoke too freely beside firelight. The tallest Easterling removed a leather tube from his belt and spread several parchments upon a flat stone. Hallis leaned forward slightly, straining to see through the narrow gap in the ruined wall. Upon one parchment appeared the rough outline of a mountain pass leading eastward through the ice. Beside it, written in crude black ink, was the same word Hallis had found upon the dead scout's map. Angruin. The leader tapped the parchment with a thick finger scarred by burns. "Tomorrow we reach the furnace gates," he said quietly. "The Nazgul comes within 3 days, and all must be prepared before his arrival." At those words, the night itself seemed to grow colder. Hallis felt the blood drain slowly from his face, while the men around the fire lowered their voices with sudden unease. Even these hardened servants of the enemy feared the ringwraiths. One man touched a charm hanging at his throat, as though to ward off evil, despite the allegiance he served. Hallis had never seen a Nazgul, yet he had heard enough tales from wandering survivors of the South to know that where such beings rode, despair followed close behind. Whatever lay hidden within the valley of Angruin mattered greatly enough for one of Sauron's dead captains to oversee it personally. That knowledge alone would force Elrond to act swiftly. Hallis shifted carefully, meaning to retreat unseen into the mountains before dawn, but the frozen stone beneath his boot cracked sharply beneath his weight. The sound was small, no louder than a snapping twig, yet every head around the fire turned instantly toward the darkness of the ruined tower. Silence fell hard and sudden over the court. Hallis drew his sword in one smooth motion as the Easterlings rose to their feet. Torchlight spilled across steel and cruel faces, while the leader narrowed his eyes toward the shadows. "There!" one hissed. Hallis moved before they could surround him. He burst from behind the broken wall and drove shoulder first into the nearest man, knocking him backward into the fire pit as sparks exploded into the night. Another Easterling swung a curved blade wildly, but Hallis caught the strike against his sword and slashed across the attacker's thigh. The man screamed and fell into the snow, clutching his leg while the others rushed forward with snarling curses. Hallis leaped over the ruined stones toward his horse as arrows hissed past him into the darkness. One shaft tore through his cloak. Another struck the pillar beside his head, showering splinters of frozen rock across his face. His horse reared in terror as he seized the reins and pulled himself into the saddle. The Easterlings gave chase at once, mounting their own horses while shouting furiously into the night. Hallis spurred his mount down the narrow northern trail, icy wind clawing against his face as the ruin vanished behind him. Hoofbeats thundered across the frozen hills in pursuit, drawing closer with every passing moment. Ahead, the trail curved sharply beside a ravine, hidden beneath drifting snow. Hallis knew the ground here was treacherous, for he had crossed it once years before with other rangers during a winter patrol. He leaned low against the horse's neck and whispered a desperate prayer beneath his breath as they raced through the dark. Behind him, torches blazed like hunting stars across the wilderness, and somewhere far beyond the mountains of the east, unseen beneath ice and stone, ancient fires had begun to wake once more. The trail vanished beneath fresh snow before midnight, swallowed by the white emptiness stretching across the foothills of Forodwaith. Hallis urged his horse onward, through drifts that reached nearly to the animal's chest, while the sound of pursuit echoed behind him like the beating of war drums beneath the earth. The eastern riders had split apart during the chase, some remaining upon the main trail, while others spread into the hills to cut off escape. Hallis could hear their horns now and then through the screaming wind, low and sharp, signaling to one another across the dark valleys. He risked a glance over his shoulder and saw torchlight weaving through the storm far behind him. They were gaining slowly. His horse was tiring, foam gathering along its flanks despite the bitter cold, and the ground ahead grew steeper with every mile. A narrow ridge emerged through the swirling snow, rising sharply above a deep ravine hidden beneath shadows. Hallis pulled hard upon the reins and guided the horse upward along the icy slope, loose stones tumbling beneath the hooves into darkness below. The beast trembled with exhaustion, yet it climbed bravely, snorting clouds of steam into the freezing air. Hallis leaned low in the saddle, searching desperately for the old path he remembered from years before. Somewhere ahead lay a hunter's cave, once used by wandering Losth tribes during the winter months. If the snows had not buried it entirely, he might still find shelter there until daylight. Another horn sounded behind him, much closer now, followed by the distant pounding of hooves climbing the ridge. The storm thickened suddenly, sweeping across the mountains with savage force. Snow lashed Hallis's face so fiercely that he could barely keep his eyes open, and the world shrank into shifting curtains of white. The ridge beneath him narrowed to little more than a shelf of ice clinging to the mountainside. One misstep would send horse and rider plunging into the abyss below. Hallis slowed at last, allowing the animal to pick its footing carefully through the gale while he strained to see anything beyond the storm. Then, through the whiteness ahead, he glimpsed dark stone rising from the slope like the mouth of some buried beast. Relief struck him so sharply he nearly laughed aloud. He guided the horse toward the cave entrance and slid quickly from the saddle, his legs stiff and aching from the long ride. The cave was shallow but dry, sheltered from the wind by an overhanging shelf of rock blackened with old smoke stains. Hallis led the horse inside and covered its muzzle gently with both hands until the frightened creature calmed beneath his touch. Outside, the storm howled across the ridge with such violence that even the mountains seemed to groan beneath its weight. Hallis listened carefully for signs of pursuit, but heard only wind and distant thunder rolling somewhere beyond the peaks. The Easterlings had either lost the trail or chosen not to risk the ridge in darkness. For the moment, at least, he had escaped them. He crouched beside the cave wall and forced warmth back into his numb hands, while his thoughts churned restlessly. Angruin. The name echoed in his mind like a warning bell. Fire of iron. He had encountered the word only once before, long ago in Rivendell, while listening to ancient tales recited beside Elrond's hearth. In the elder days, hidden furnaces had been built in the far north by servants of Morgoth, where strange metals were forged for wars against elves and men. Most had been destroyed after the fall of Thangorodrim, when the world itself was broken and remade. Yet some ruins remained buried beneath mountains and glaciers, forgotten by all, save those who searched for darkness. Hallis stared into the blackness beyond the cave mouth and wondered what kind of fire could survive beneath ice for thousands of years. Sleep came only in fragments through the long hours before dawn. Each time Hallis closed his eyes, he saw again the burned mark hanging from the necks of the Easterlings, and heard the fear in their voices when they spoke of the Nazgul. At last he rose stiffly and stepped outside into the pale blue light of morning. The storm had passed eastward during the night, leaving the mountains buried beneath fresh snow that glittered beneath a cold and cloudless sky. The silence that followed seemed unnatural after the fury of the gale. Hallis climbed carefully to the ridge above the cave and searched the valleys below. No riders moved upon the slopes now. No smoke rose from distant camps, yet he knew better than to believe the danger had ended. By midday, he descended from the northern hills and turned southward toward the hidden roads leading to Rivendell. The journey took 3 hard days through frozen wilderness and dark pine forests, where ancient shadows lingered beneath the trees. Hallis traveled swiftly, avoiding open ground whenever possible, for twice he glimpsed mounted scouts far off among the hills. Whether they were the same Easterlings or others searching the region he could not tell. Once he found the carcass of a stag hanging from an old oak beside the trail, its throat slit and its body marked with strange runes burned into the flesh. Hallis rode past without stopping, though the sight filled him with unease deeper than hunger or cold. Something had changed in the north. The servants of Mordor no longer wandered like scattered raiders. They moved with purpose now. On the 4th evening, the Bruinen River appeared through the trees, silver beneath the fading light of sunset. Beyond it rose the hidden valley of Imladris, sheltered beneath pine-covered slopes and waterfalls shining like glass among the rocks. Warm lights glimmered through the trees ahead, soft and golden against the deepening dusk, and for the first time in many days, Hallis felt some measure of peace return to him. Rivendell endured untouched, while so much of Middle-earth darkened around it. The smell of wood smoke drifted gently through the evening air, mingling with the scent of wet stone and cedar. Somewhere within the valley, elves were singing. The guards at the hidden ford recognized Hallas at once and hurried him across the river without delay. His horse nearly collapsed from exhaustion upon the final climb into the valley, and stable hands rushed forward to take the trembling animal away, while Hallas staggered toward the great house. Lanterns glowed warmly beneath carved arches of stone, and voices echoed softly through the courtyards beyond. Yet beneath the beauty and calm of Rivendell, Hallas sensed tension lingering like an unseen shadow. Elves moved swiftly through the halls with grave expressions, and more than once he saw armed wardens speaking quietly beside the doorways. Word of unrest had already reached this place. Elrond received him that same night, within a long chamber overlooking the river. Firelight danced across polished pillars and woven banners, while rain whispered softly against the high windows. The Master of Rivendell stood beside the hearth, clad in dark blue robes, his silver hair falling loosely upon his shoulders. Though his face remained calm, his eyes held the weary depth of one who had witnessed too many ages of grief and war. Beside him stood another figure, shorter and broader, wrapped in a heavy traveling cloak trimmed with fur. A dwarf. Hallas recognized the crest upon the clasp at once. Khazad-dûm. "You have ridden hard," Elrond said quietly as Hallas entered the chamber. "Sit and speak freely." Hallas removed his gloves, slowly, flexing aching fingers before the warmth of the fire. "I found 2 of your scouts, dead near the northern ridges," he said. "Easterlings are gathering in the mountains beyond Forodwaith. They spoke of a hidden forge called Angruin." He withdrew the damaged parchment from within his cloak and handed it across the table. "They believe a Nazgul will soon arrive there." At once the chamber fell silent, save for the crackling of the hearth. Elrond studied the map without speaking, and the dwarf beside him muttered a curse beneath his breath in Khuzd-dûm. Hallas noticed then that the dwarf's hands were stained black with soot, as though he had come straight from a furnace himself. At length Elrond looked up, his expression darker than before. "Then our fears were true," he said. "The servants of Sauron have found one of the buried smithies of the north." The dwarf folded his thick arms across his chest. "If it is truly Angruin," he growled, "then no common forge lies beneath those mountains. My father spoke of it once in secret. A furnace built in the elder days, where iron was mixed with fires drawn from deep beneath the earth itself. Weapons forged there would not dull or break. Some were said to burn even after death claimed the hand that carried them." Hallas stared at him across the firelight. "And you are?" The dwarf's dark eyes narrowed slightly before he answered. "Daenor, son of Borin, master smith of Khazad-dûm. I was sent here because Lord Durin believes the enemy searches for lost craft, older than memory." He stepped closer to the table and jabbed one thick finger against the map. "If Sauron claims that furnace, every kingdom west of the mountains will feel it soon enough." Rain battered suddenly against the windows as wind swept through the valley outside. Hallas looked from the dwarf to Elrond and saw the truth plainly upon both their faces. The matter had already gone beyond rumor or distant fear. War was creeping northward once again, quiet as snowfall, and somewhere beneath the frozen mountains, an ancient fire had begun to breathe. The rain continued through the night, drumming softly upon the roofs and terraces of Rivendell, while mist gathered among the pine trees beyond the valley. Hallas slept little, despite the warmth of the house, for his dreams were restless and broken by glimpses of burning furnaces beneath endless ice. Before dawn, he rose from his chamber and wandered through the quiet halls where lamps still glowed faintly against carved stone. Rivendell at such an hour felt suspended between worlds, neither sleeping nor fully awake. Somewhere distant, water sang over rocks in hidden gardens, and the smell of cedar smoke drifted through the corridors. Hallis paused beside an open archway overlooking the river below, breathing deeply of the cool air while unease pressed steadily against his thoughts. The north no longer felt distant to him now. Its shadow had crossed the mountains and entered this valley. He found Elrond already awake within the Eastern Library, standing beside a long table strewn with ancient maps and weathered scrolls. Several candles burned low around him, filling the chamber with golden light and the scent of melted wax. Dana stood nearby, stripped of his travel cloak, revealing thick arms scarred by years of labor beside the forge. Another figure had joined them during the night. She stood near the shelves in a dark green cloak, her pale hair braided simply behind her shoulders, one hand resting lightly upon a curved bow, taller than herself. Hallis recognized her kind at once by the quiet sharpness of her eyes and the woodland grace in her posture. A sylvan elf. "This is Lothario of Greenwood," Elrond said, as Hallis approached the table. "She has hunted the servants of Dol Guldur along the forest borders for many years. Few know the northern wilds better." Lothario inclined her head slightly. "Your trail from Forodwaith was not difficult to follow," she said, her voice calm but edged with dry amusement. "You ride hard, Ranger, but not quietly." Daenor snorted into his beard, while Hallis allowed himself the faintest smile. "I was more concerned with surviving than hiding my tracks." "As were the men chasing you," the dwarf muttered. "That alone tells us enough." Elrond spread another parchment upon the table, this one older and marked with faded elvish script, almost erased by time. "Angruin lies here," he said, tracing a slender valley east of the northern wastes. "In the First Age, the servants of Morgoth dug furnaces beneath those mountains, using volcanic vents hidden deep below the earth. Most were destroyed after the War of Wrath, but some tunnels collapsed and vanished beneath glaciers before they could be sealed entirely." His finger moved farther south. "If Sauron restores even one of those smithies, he may arm entire hosts faster than any kingdom now living." Hallis studied the map closely. "Then we must destroy it before the Nazgul arrives." "That will not be simple," said Lothario. "The passes are narrow, and the valleys there twist beneath the mountains like roots beneath stone. If the Easterlings hold the entrance in strength, a small company could vanish there without leaving even bones behind." Daenor grunted in agreement. "And if the old furnaces still burn, bringing the tunnels down may prove harder than you think. Ancient dwarf smiths wrote that the fire beneath Angruin fed upon strange minerals buried deep in the earth. Water could not quench it. Stone itself cracked from the heat." Elrond looked at each of them in turn, and for a moment the burden of many centuries seemed visible upon his face. "Even so," he said quietly, "the forge cannot remain in enemy hands. I will not send an army into those mountains. Too much attention would fall upon Rivendell, and secrecy still serves us better than open war. A smaller company may yet pass unseen." He paused then, his gaze lingering briefly upon Hallis. "You have already crossed their path. Will you return north once more?" Hallis answered without hesitation. "I will." The decision settled heavily over the chamber, though none spoke against it. Elrond nodded once, then turned toward the shelves lining the far wall. "There is one more matter," he said. You will not travel alone." The library doors opened softly behind them, and another elf entered, carrying a small satchel of herbs and bandages slung over one shoulder. He appeared younger than the others, though in Rivendell appearances often lied. Dark hair framed a lean, thoughtful face, marked by quiet weariness, and his grey robes bore no sign of rank or noble house. Yet Hallis noticed immediately that Elrond regarded him with unusual gravity. "This is Callan here," said Elrond, "a healer of Rivendell. He has knowledge that may prove necessary within Angruin." Callan here set the satchel gently upon the table. "Necessary," he repeated softly, though something troubled moved behind his eyes. "Or dangerous." Dana eyed him suspiciously. "A healer for a journey into cursed tunnels. I would rather bring another axe." "You may yet need both," Callan here replied. Silence lingered for a moment before Elrond spoke again. "Long ago, during the early years after the forging of the Rings of Power, Callan here served among the smiths of Eregion." The word seemed to darken the room itself. He studied under craftsmen who once dealt with Anatar before Sauron's treachery was revealed. Hallis saw Lithariel stiffen slightly beside the shelves. Even Dana's expression hardened. The name Anatar still carried poison after so many centuries. Sauron had worn fair form in those days, deceiving elves and smiths alike with promises of wisdom and mastery. Callanhir lowered his gaze toward the table. "I was young then," he said quietly, "foolish enough to admire knowledge without questioning its source. I never forged a ring, nor touched one, but I learned certain arts from those who did." His fingers tightened faintly against the edge of the satchel. "Some fires leave marks that never wholly fade." Daenor's heavy brow furrowed. "You believe whatever burns beneath Angruin is tied to the rings?" "I believe Sauron would not send a Nazgul north for ordinary steel," Callan here answered. "There are older powers buried beneath those mountains than mere weapons." The room fell silent once more. Outside the windows, dawn had begun to creep over the valley, pale light filtering through rain clouds and silvering the river below. Hallis felt the weight of the journey settling upon him at last. This would not be a simple scouting mission into wild country. They were walking toward something ancient and hidden, something born in the darkness of the elder days and awakened now by the enemy's hand. Preparations began before sunrise. Rivendell stirred quietly around them as supplies were gathered in secret. Ropes, winter cloaks, preserved food, lamp oil, and weapons suited for narrow fighting underground. Daenor spent nearly an hour inspecting every blade and buckle himself, muttering disapproval at elven craftsmanship, even while secretly admiring it. Hallis watched the dwarf sharpen a heavy axe beside the forge courtyard, sparks flying bright against the grey morning air. "You truly believe these old tales?" Hallis asked, as he crouched nearby, tightening straps upon his saddle. Dana glanced up without pausing his work. "I believe fire remembers," he said. "Stone, too. Folk think evil disappears when kingdoms fall, but mountains keep secrets longer than men keep songs." He tested the axe edge carefully with one thick thumb. "My grandsire fought orcs in tunnels beneath the misty mountains, where the walls still carried heat from furnaces dead for thousands of years. Some places are poisoned forever." Hallis frowned thoughtfully. "And yet you came willingly." "Aye," Daenor replied with a grim smile, "because if the enemy begins shaping weapons from those old fires again, dwarves will be the first blamed for it, whether we deserve it or not." By evening, the company stood ready at the eastern gate of Rivendell, beneath a sky heavy with gathering clouds. Their horses stamped impatiently upon the wet stones, while the Bruinen rushed loudly below the cliffs. Elrond came to see them depart, cloaked against the cold wind rising through the valley. He spoke quietly with Lothario for a time in Sindarin, before turning to the others. "Speed matters now more than stealth," he warned. "If the Nazgul reaches Angruen before you do, the forge may become impossible to destroy." Calanhir adjusted the straps of his satchel uneasily. "And if we fail?" Elrond's eyes darkened. "Then the war already stirring in the east will spread faster than any of us fear." No one answered. The truth of it hung plainly in the cold evening air. They rode out soon after, crossing the river beneath fading light, while Rivendell slowly vanished behind them among the trees. Hallis glanced back only once. Lanterns glimmered warmly through the mist, like distant stars, before the forest swallowed them entirely. Ahead lay only wilderness and shadow. Lothario guided them northward, along hidden trails beneath the pines, her sharp eyes constantly searching the darkening woods. Dano rode silently beside Hallis, one hand resting upon the haft of his axe, while Calanhir lingered farther behind, lost in thoughts he did not share. Night settled fully around the company as they climbed into the hills east of the valley. The wind carried the scent of coming snow once more, cold and metallic upon the air. Far beyond the mountains ahead, unseen fires waited beneath stone older than memory, and with every mile northward, the world seemed to grow quieter, as though Middle-earth itself were listening for what would come next. For 3 days the company rode beneath dark forests, where winter clung stubbornly to the earth, despite the turning of the season. Frost silvered the branches each morning, and the rivers they crossed ran black beneath sheets of brittle ice that cracked softly along the edges. Lothario led them through hidden paths, known only to wandering elves and hunters of the wild, avoiding old roads whenever possible. They saw no villages now, no smoke rising from farmhouses, no travelers upon the trails. The farther north they rode, the emptier the land became. Even the birds seemed to vanish from those woods, leaving only the sound of wind moving through the trees and the steady rhythm of hoofbeats upon frozen ground. Hallis noticed the silence, most during the evenings when they made camp beneath the pines. Fires were kept small and shielded carefully between stones, their glow hidden beneath thick branches overhead. Daenor cooked in grim silence, muttering curses whenever damp wood refused to burn properly, while Calanhir sorted herbs and bandages beside the flames with distant concentration. Lothario rarely slept for more than an hour at a time. She often vanished into the darkness alone, returning before dawn with snow upon her cloak and fresh worry in her eyes. On the 4th night, Hallis finally asked what troubled her. "We are being followed," she said quietly, while sharpening an arrowhead beside the fire. "Not closely. Whoever they are, they know enough to keep beyond sight." Daenor grunted from across the camp. "Orcs?" Lothario shook her head. "Too disciplined for orcs. I found no careless tracks, no broken branches. Only signs carefully hidden." She paused briefly, listening toward the trees. "They are patient." Calanhir looked up slowly from his satchel. "The Easterlings from the tower." "Perhaps," she answered. "Or perhaps others." The next morning, snow began to fall again, thin at first and drifting lazily through the trees. By midday, the storm thickened until the world beyond the forest faded into white shadow. The company pressed onward despite the weather, following a narrow path winding through steep hills choked with ancient pines. Hallis rode near the front beside Lethariel, his gloved hand resting constantly near his sword. More than once he thought he glimpsed movement between the trees behind them, swift shapes vanishing before he could focus upon them clearly. The feeling of unseen eyes followed him through every mile. Near dusk, they reached the ruins of an old stone bridge crossing a frozen gorge. Half the structure had collapsed into the chasm below long ago, leaving only a narrow span of cracked rock stretching over darkness. Wind roared upward through the ravine, carrying the smell of snow and distant water. Lothariel dismounted first and tested the bridge carefully with one boot before motioning the others forward. "One at a time," she warned. "The stone is weak." Daenor eyed the bridge sourly. "Elves build pretty roads," he muttered, "but dwarves build roads that stay standing." "Then perhaps you should have built this one," Hallas replied dryly. The dwarf snorted, but said no more as Hallas guided his horse slowly across the broken span. The wind tore fiercely at cloak and reins, while loose stones rattled into the abyss beneath his feet. Halfway across, he glanced downward and saw only darkness below, deep enough to swallow even the sound of falling rock. His horse trembled beneath him, but continued onward. When at last he reached the far side, he exhaled slowly and turned back toward the others. That was when the arrow struck. The shaft hissed from the storm and buried itself deep into the bridge beside Daenor's boot. A second arrow followed instantly, shattering against stone near Hallas's head. Lothariel reacted before anyone else. She seized her bow and vanished behind a broken pillar, while another volley came screaming from the trees beyond the gorge. "Down!" she shouted. More arrows rained through the snowstorm, dark shapes moving among the pines across the ravine. Hallas dragged his horse behind a crumbling section of wall as Daenor roared angrily and hurled himself flat upon the bridge stones. Calanhir crouched beside the near side of the span, one hand pressed against the neck of his panicked horse, while arrows shattered against the rocks around him. "Can you see them?" Hallas shouted. "Barely," Lothariel answered from cover. "6 at least. Maybe more." An arrow flashed from her bow a heartbeat later, disappearing into the white storm beyond the bridge. A cry answered from the trees across the gorge. The attackers shifted position at once, spreading wider through the forest while continuing to fire. These were no common raiders. Their shots came measured and disciplined, driving the company into cover rather than wasting arrows blindly. Daenor crawled toward Hallas across the broken stones, snow gathering thickly in his beard. "They're trying to trap us on the bridge," he growled. "If they rush now, we'll have nowhere to stand." Another arrow struck sparks from the rocks beside him. Hallas risked a glance through the swirling snow and caught sight of one attacker briefly between the trees. Fur-lined armor, curved blade at the hip. "Easterlings. They followed us from the north," he said grimly. Lothariel fired again, and another shadow fell among the pines. "Not all of them," she called sharply. "Look there." Hallas turned toward the far ridge beyond the attackers and felt cold settle heavily in his stomach. A lone, mounted figure stood motionless upon the snowy rise overlooking the gorge. Black robes whipped violently in the storm around both rider and horse, though neither seemed troubled by the wind. Even at that distance, Hallas could feel the thing watching them. Calanhir saw it as well. His face drained pale beneath the snow. "No," he whispered. The rider did not move or speak, yet a terrible dread spread slowly across the gorge like poison seeping through water. The horses began shrieking in panic, pulling wildly at their reins. Frost crept visibly across the stones near the bridge, while the air itself seemed to grow heavy and thin. Hallas felt sudden weakness in his limbs, as though invisible hands pressed against his chest. "A Nazgul," Lothariel said softly, and for the first time since Hallas had met her, Fear entered her voice. The ringwraith raised one long black arm toward the bridge. At once the Easterlings surged forward through the trees. They charged from the storm with harsh cries, swords drawn, boots pounding across the snow-covered rocks. Arrows still hissed from behind them, while 3 warriors rushed directly onto the bridge itself. Hallas met the first with steel. Their blades clashed violently upon the narrow span, sparks leaping bright against the darkness. The Easterlings struck hard and fast, forcing Hallas backward toward the broken edge where the ravine yawned beneath them. Wind screamed upward around their feet, while snow blinded both men alike. Daenor crashed into the second attacker with a roar like falling stone. His axe split shield and arm together in a spray of blood before the man could recover. The dwarf fought like something born from the mountains themselves, relentless and brutal in the confined space. Another Easterling lunged at him from behind, but Lothariel's arrow struck clean through the warrior's throat before the blade could fall. Meanwhile, Calanhir remained frozen near the far side of the bridge, staring toward the distant Nazgul, with horror carved plainly across his face. The ringwraith had not moved from the ridge, yet its presence alone seemed enough to choke the strength from every living thing nearby. Frost spread across Calanhir's sleeves and hair, while his breath came sharp and shallow. "Hallas!" Lothariel shouted suddenly. Hallas turned just in time to see another attacker rushing toward Calanhir through the snow. The Easterling's curved sword rose high above his head, while the healer stood motionless, trapped by terror. Hallas tried to reach him, but his own opponent drove forward savagely, blocking the path. Then fire burst from Calanhir's hands. Not ordinary flame. This burned white and silver, blinding against the storm, roaring outward in a sudden wave of heat that sent snow exploding into steam around the bridge. The attacking Easterling screamed as fire consumed him instantly, hurling his burning body backward into the gorge below. Even Hallas staggered from the force of the blast, shielding his eyes against the terrible brightness. For one heartbeat, the entire gorge fell silent. Then the Nazgul shrieked. The sound tore through the storm like a blade through flesh, so filled with hatred and agony that every horse reared, screaming in terror. The ringwraith wheeled sharply upon its black mount and vanished into the blizzard beyond the ridge. At once the remaining Easterlings broke apart in panic. Some fled back into the trees while others stumbled blindly through the snow as though desperate only to escape. Daenor lowered his axe slowly, breathing hard. "By the roots of the mountain," he muttered. Steam drifted across the shattered bridge where snow had melted entirely around Calanhir's feet. The healer stood trembling violently, staring down at his own hands as though he no longer recognized them. The silver fire had vanished, leaving only scorched stone and the smell of ash lingering in the frozen air. Lothariel approached him cautiously, bow still raised. What was that? Calanhir swallowed hard, but did not answer immediately. Beyond the gorge, the storm continued to howl through the pines, while darkness gathered among the hills. At last, he lifted his eyes toward the others, and Hallas saw deep shame there, mixed with exhaustion and fear. "The fire beneath Angruin," Calanhir said quietly, "is not the only ancient flame waking in Middle-earth." They left the bridge before nightfall, moving quickly through the storm, while fear still lingered behind them, like the shadow of a drawn blade. No one spoke much during the first hours after the attack. Even Daenor remained unusually silent as they climbed narrow paths, winding upward through broken hills crusted with ice. The horses were nervous now, ears twitching constantly at every gust of wind or shifting shadow among the rocks. Hallis rode near the rear, watching the white darkness behind them for signs of pursuit, but the Nazgul did not return. That troubled him more than open pursuit would have. A servant of Sauron did not abandon prey without reason. The snow eased near midnight as they entered a region of steep cliffs and frozen waterfalls. Jagged stone walls rose around them on every side, black against the pale moonlight breaking through torn clouds overhead. Lothario finally called a halt within the shelter of a narrow ravine where ancient pines clung stubbornly to the rocks. They built no fire. The memory of the ringwraith's presence still hung heavily over them, and none wished to draw attention in those barren heights. Instead, they sat wrapped in cloaks beneath the trees, while cold seeped upward from the frozen ground. At length, Daenor fixed his dark eyes upon Calanhir across the camp. "You owe us an explanation," the dwarf said flatly. "And do not try speaking in riddles like elves often do, when plain truth will serve better." Calanhir sat motionless for a time, staring into the darkness beyond the ravine. Moonlight silvered his pale face, revealing exhaustion etched deeply beneath his eyes. Hallis noticed the healer's hands still trembled faintly beneath his gloves. "I was born in Eregion before its fall," Calanhir said at last. "My father worked among the lesser smiths serving Celebrimbor during the forging of the Rings of Power. I was young, barely more than a child by elven reckoning, but I remember the workshops, the heat, the sound of hammers day and night." He paused, swallowing slowly. "When Anatar came among us, many believed him wise beyond any living craftsman. He taught secrets no elf had heard since the Elder days." Lothariel's gaze hardened. Secrets bought with lies. "Yes," Calanhir answered softly. "But by the time we understood that, it was already too late." The wind whispered through the pines above them, while the company listened in silence. Far off among the mountains came the distant cracking of shifting ice. "My father became obsessed with the craft Anatar taught," Calanhir continued. "Not the rings themselves, lesser things. Metals strengthened beyond breaking, flame shaped through will alone. He believed such knowledge could preserve our people against the darkness spreading eastward." A bitter shadow crossed his face. "Sauron knew well how to tempt those who feared loss." Daenor folded his thick arms. "Your father served the enemy willingly then." "For a time," Calanhir admitted, "until he realized what price such craft demanded. By then war had already come upon Eregion. Sauron's armies burned the land, and many fled westward, seeking refuge." His voice grew quieter. "My father did not escape." Hallis leaned forward slightly. "And the fire you used upon the bridge?" Calanhir closed his eyes briefly before answering. Before the fall, certain smiths experimented with old techniques drawn from Morgoth's corrupted furnaces. They believed pure intent could master corrupted flame. He gave a hollow laugh without humor. "Fools! Fire does not care who commands it. Once awakened, it remembers only hunger." Daenor spat into the snow. That sounded less like a healer's craft, and more like sorcery. "Perhaps it is," Calanhir said. Silence settled heavily over the ravine after that. Hallis could sense distrust growing among them like frost spreading across stone. Lothariel watched Calanhir carefully now, one hand resting near the knife at her belt. Even Daenor's expression carried unease beneath his usual bluntness. Yet Hallis remembered the bridge clearly. Without that terrible burst of silver fire, they would all lie dead in the snow or worse. Before dawn, they resumed the journey northward. The land changed steadily as they climbed deeper into the mountains. Trees grew sparse and twisted, bent low by endless winds blowing down from the frozen peaks. Great scars split the earth, where avalanches had torn entire slopes bare long ago. Here and there they passed the remains of ancient walls, half buried beneath ice, relics of forgotten fortresses, built during wars older than any living kingdom of men. Hallas found himself glancing often toward those ruins, imagining hidden eyes watching from shattered towers. On the second evening after the bridge, Lothariel halted suddenly beside a narrow pass overlooking a broad valley below. The others dismounted beside her and stared in silence at the sight spread beneath the fading light. Far below, black smoke rose into the evening sky. Not campfires, furnaces, the valley stretched eastward between steep mountains choked with glaciers and jagged cliffs. At its center stood the broken remains of an ancient fortress built directly into the stone itself. Great walls of dark iron and black rock emerged from the mountainside like the ribs of some buried beast. Snow had collapsed much of the upper structure long ago, yet fire now glowed faintly from deep cracks and shattered archways beneath the ruin. Lines of torchlight moved across the valley floor, where armed figures hauled carts and timber toward the fortress gates. Angruin. Even from that distance, Hallas could hear the dull thunder of hammers echoing faintly through the mountains. Daenor cursed softly beneath his breath. They've already begun restoring the furnaces. Lothariel crouched low behind the rocks, studying the valley carefully. Too many guards for a direct assault. At least 50 that I can see, and likely more inside the ruins. Hallas narrowed his eyes toward the fortress. Do you see the Nazgul? No, she answered, but that means little. Calanhir remained very still beside his horse, staring toward the black fortress with an expression Hallas could not fully read. Fear lingered there, certainly, but something else as well. Recognition. You know this place, Hallas said quietly. Calanhir hesitated before nodding once. I have never stood here, he admitted, but I have seen drawings copied from older records in Eregion. Morgoth's servants used Angruin during the First Age to forge weapons for wars against the Noldor in the north. His eyes drifted toward the fires glowing beneath the ruined walls. The furnaces were fed by vents reaching deep into the roots of the mountains. Some believed the heat below came from remnants of the ancient fires that once shaped Arda itself. Daenor grunted uneasily. No forge should burn that deep. As darkness settled fully across the valley, the company withdrew from the pass and concealed themselves within a narrow cave overlooking the eastern slopes. There they studied the fortress, while distant hammering echoed through the night below. Hallas watched lines of workers moving between fires like ants crawling over a carcass. Most were Easterlings, though he also glimpsed larger shapes among them. Orcs. Wagons loaded with raw iron stood near the outer gates, and armed patrols circled constantly along the valley edges. They're preparing for war, Hallas murmured. For more than war, Calanhir said quietly. He removed a small bundle wrapped in cloth from his satchel and unfolded it carefully upon the cave floor. Inside lay several brittle pages covered in faded Elvish script and strange symbols darkened with age. Daenor leaned closer at once, frowning beneath the firelight of their shuttered lantern. What is this? Copies taken from records hidden in Rivendell, Calanhir answered. I did not wish to speak of them before now. He touched one page gently. The furnaces beneath Angruin were not built merely to forge weapons. Morgoth's smiths sought something greater. Lithariel's eyes narrowed. Speak plainly. Calanhir looked toward the valley below before answering. The old texts claim certain metals forged within Angruin could hold fragments of power bound into them, not unlike the rings themselves, though far cruder. His voice lowered further. If Sauron restores that craft, he may create weapons carrying part of his own will. The cave fell silent, save for the distant rumble of hammers rising from below. Daenor stared hard at the ancient pages. You mean cursed blades? Yes, Calanhir said. Blades that spread fear, armor that strengthens hatred, fire that answers only to the enemy. Hallis felt cold settle deeper within him, despite the closeness of the cave. The war spreading across Middle-earth had suddenly become far more dangerous than armies alone. Sauron did not merely seek conquest. He sought corruption. Weapons shaped from such craft could poison kingdoms long after battles ended. Lithariel turned back toward the valley, her face grim beneath the lantern glow. Then we destroy the furnaces tonight. Daenor shook his head sharply. Not with 50 guards watching every gate. There may be another entrance, Calanhir said quietly. All eyes turned toward him. He spread another parchment across the cave floor, revealing a faded map of tunnels running beneath the fortress. Most lines had been crossed out, or marked, collapsed, but one narrow passage extended deep beneath the mountain toward the western cliffs. A ventilation shaft, Calanhir explained, used long ago by furnace workers. If the passage still exists, it may lead beneath the outer defenses. Daenor studied the map carefully. Or straight into a tomb. Perhaps, Calanhir admitted. Hallis looked once more toward the valley below, where the fires of Angruin burned against the darkness like wounds in the earth. Smoke rolled upward into the starless sky, while the sound of iron striking iron echoed endlessly through the mountains. Then, far below near the fortress gates, horns began to sound. The company froze. Lines of torches suddenly appeared along the valley roads, stretching eastward into the dark. Riders approached through the snow in disciplined ranks, black banners snapping above them in the wind. And at the center of the column rode a figure cloaked entirely in black. The horns echoed across the valley long after the riders disappeared through the fortress gates. From their hiding place high among the western cliffs, the company watched black shapes moving below, like ants gathering around a carcass. Torches flared brighter along the walls of Angruin, while drums began beating somewhere deep within the ruined stronghold, slow and heavy enough to vibrate faintly through the stone beneath their feet. The Nazgul had arrived. Even at that distance, Hallis could feel a suffocating weight settling over the valley, as though the mountain itself recoiled from the thing now passing beneath its gates. No one spoke for several moments after the column vanished into the fortress. The wind outside the cave had fallen strangely still, leaving only the distant thunder of hammers and the low chanting of unseen voices rising from below. Daenor broke the silence first. "Then we've no more time for caution," he muttered. "If the Ringwraith begins overseeing the forge directly, every tunnel in that mountain will soon swarm with guards." Lithariel remained crouched near the cave mouth, eyes fixed upon the valley. "There are already more patrols moving along the western slopes." She pointed toward faint torchlight threading through the snow below. "They expect trouble." Calanhir rolled the ancient tunnel map closed with careful hands. "The shaft entrance lies farther north along the cliffside. If snow and stone have not sealed it entirely, we may still enter unseen. His voice sounded distant again, distracted by thoughts he would not share aloud. Once inside, we must reach the furnace chamber itself. Destroying outer workshops will accomplish little. Hallis glanced toward him. And how do we destroy something that has burned since the elder days? Callan here hesitated. By collapsing the vents beneath it. The old records speak of support pillars carved directly into the volcanic channels. If those fail, the tunnels should bury themselves. Should, Daenor repeated darkly, a comforting word. Night deepened around them as they prepared to descend toward the hidden shaft. Horses were left concealed within a narrow ravine farther west, with enough food for several days, if luck held. Hallis lingered briefly beside his mount before fastening the reins securely to a low pine branch. The animal pressed its muzzle against his shoulder with a weary snort, and for a moment he wished fiercely that he were riding south instead of descending into the black furnace valley below. Yet the thought vanished quickly. Too many lives now depended upon what happened inside Angruin. They traveled on foot thereafter, moving carefully along narrow ledges crusted with ice. The mountainside fell sharply beside them into darkness, broken only by scattered torchlight far below. More than once, loose stones slid beneath their boots and vanished soundlessly into the abyss. Hallis kept one hand against the freezing cliff wall, while the other rested near his sword. The cold had become sharper here, carrying a strange metallic scent mixed with smoke drifting upward from the forge. It reminded him faintly of blood upon iron. At last, Lethariel raised one hand for silence. Ahead, partly concealed beneath hanging sheets of ice, a narrow crack opened within the mountainside. "There," Callan here whispered. The entrance was little wider than a man's shoulders, hidden behind fallen rocks and centuries of frozen snow. Cold air flowed steadily outward from the darkness, carrying the smell of ash and deep earth. Daenor knelt beside the opening and ran one thick hand across the stone. "Dwarven work," he murmured. "Very old." "Can you tell if it still holds?" Hallis asked. The dwarf grunted softly. "Only one way to know." They squeezed into the passage single file, Lethariel leading with bow in hand, while Hallis carried a shuttered lantern behind her. The tunnel descended steeply through ancient stone, slick with moisture and black soot. In places the ceiling had partially collapsed, forcing them to crawl beneath jagged rocks, while icy water dripped steadily from above. Yet beneath the cold, another sensation slowly emerged. Warmth. At first it came faintly, barely noticeable against the mountain chill. But as they descended deeper, the air grew steadily hotter, until steam curled visibly from their cloaks. The smell of sulfur thickened around them. Somewhere far below, something enormous rumbled through the stone like distant thunder. "The furnaces are still alive," Daenor muttered uneasily. The tunnel widened after nearly an hour into a vast chamber, supported by cracked pillars, blackened with age. Ancient chains hung rusting from the ceiling, while broken carts and shattered tools lay scattered across the floor, beneath centuries of dust. Hallis raised the lantern higher and saw old bones among the debris, dozens of them. Men? Orcs? Perhaps worse. Lethariel crouched beside one skeleton near the wall. "These did not die in battle," she said quietly. Hallis approached and saw the truth immediately. The bones were twisted unnaturally, fingers clawed against the stone, as though death had come slowly and painfully. Strange black stains marked the floor around several corpses, even after all those ages. Callan Hoare stared at the remains with visible dread. The fumes, he whispered. Old records warned that prolonged exposure near the deep furnaces poisoned the lungs and mind alike. Daenor spat upon the ground. Then Morgoth servants worked their slaves to death down here. A faint metallic clang echoed suddenly through the tunnels ahead. The company froze. Another clang followed. Then voices. Lithoriel extinguished the lantern instantly, plunging the chamber into darkness, broken only by a dim red glow flickering somewhere far below. They moved silently behind fallen stone blocks, while footsteps approached through the tunnels beyond. Hallis slowed his breathing and peered carefully around the edge of the rubble. 3 orcs shuffled into the chamber, carrying pickaxes and bundles of iron chains. Their armor was crude and soot-covered, faces hidden beneath ragged hoods against the heat rising from deeper tunnels. They spoke harshly among themselves while crossing toward a side passage opposite the company's hiding place. "More prisoners arriving tomorrow," one growled. "The Black Captain wants the lower furnaces working before the moon turns." Another spat angrily. "Too hot below. Men collapse after hours." "Then more men will come," the first answered with a laugh. The third orc suddenly stopped walking. It sniffed the air sharply. Hallis's hand tightened around his sword. The creature turned slowly toward the shadows where they hid, yellow eyes narrowing. For one terrible heartbeat, nobody moved. Then Lithariel's arrow struck clean through its throat. The orc collapsed without a cry. Hallis and Daenor lunged from cover at once. Steel flashed in the darkness. One surviving orc barely managed to raise its blade before Hallis drove him backward against a pillar and cut deep beneath the ribs. Daenor's axe crushed the other's skull with a wet crack that echoed horribly through the chamber. Silence returned almost instantly. Too instantly. Callan Hoare knelt beside the dead orc, grimacing at the blood spreading across the stone. "Others may have heard." "Then we move faster," Daenor growled. They dragged the bodies into darkness and continued downward through the tunnels. The deeper passages had changed. Ancient stonework gave way to newer scaffolding, and reinforced supports hammered recently into the walls. Red light flickered ahead now more strongly, accompanied by the steady roar of unseen fire. Sweat gathered beneath Hallis's collar, despite the cold lingering in the upper tunnels. The air tasted bitter and dry upon his tongue. At last the passage opened onto a ledge overlooking the heart of Angruin. Hallis stopped dead. Far below stretched an enormous cavern carved into the roots of the mountain itself. Rivers of molten rock flowed through trenches cut into black stone floors, feeding colossal furnaces built directly into the cavern walls. Great wheels and chains turned endlessly above glowing pits, while sparks rained through the smoky darkness like fiery snow. Hundreds of figures moved through the chamber below. Easterlings, orcs, slaves dragging carts filled with raw iron. The sound was deafening. Hammers crashed against anvils. Steam hissed violently from cracked pipes. Men shouted through the smoke while furnace fires roared bright enough to hurt the eyes. And at the center of it all stood the great furnace. It rose from the cavern floor like a tower of black iron wrapped in chains thicker than tree trunks. Crimson light pulsed from deep cracks running across its surface, while molten fire churned visibly behind heavy iron grates. Strange symbols glowed faintly upon the metal, shifting like living embers. Daenor stared in horror. "By Durin!" Callanhear's face had gone pale again. They restored it far faster than I feared. Below them, workers hauled long bars of newly forged metal from the furnace chamber. Hallis narrowed his eyes and saw at once that something was wrong with the iron. Even fresh from the fire, it seemed darker than natural steel, swallowing the furnace glow rather than reflecting it. Men carrying the bars moved strangely too, shoulders hunched, as though burdened by more than weight alone. Then Hallis noticed the prisoners. Rows of chained captives knelt near the lower platforms beneath heavy guard. Most were men from northern tribes by their clothing, though several dwarves could be seen among them as well, faces blackened with soot and exhaustion. Workers too weak to continue were dragged toward smaller side furnaces, where shadowy figures waited with hooked tools. Lethariel's voice hardened beside him. "We cannot leave them here." "We came to destroy the forge," Daenor replied grimly, "not wage open war against half the north." Hallis looked toward the prisoners again and felt anger rising slowly within him. One dwarf among the captives lifted his head weakly, revealing bruises across his face, and the crest of Khazad Dûm burned into his torn tunic. Daenor saw him too. The dwarf smith's expression darkened like storm clouds gathering over mountains. "That changes things," he said quietly. Before anyone could answer, a deep horn sounded through the cavern below. Workers stopped immediately. Guards dropped to one knee. From a great iron gate near the furnace tower emerged the Nazgul. Its black robes flowed unnaturally, despite the furnace heat, while terror spread through the chamber ahead of it like cold wind before winter. Even hardened Easterling soldiers lowered their eyes as the ringwraith passed among them. The creature carried no visible weapon, save a long iron staff, crowned with dark metal, shaped like twisting claws. The Nazgul halted beside the great furnace and raised one pale hand toward the fire. At once the crimson glow inside the iron tower deepened violently. And from somewhere within the furnace, something answered. The sound rising from within the furnace was not the roar of fire alone. It carried beneath it a deeper voice, low and grinding, like stone dragged slowly across stone in the roots of the earth. The cavern itself seemed to tremble in answer. Molten light pulsed through the cracks in the black iron tower, while workers below backed away uneasily despite the presence of their masters. Even the orcs glanced toward the furnace with naked fear upon their twisted faces. Hallis crouched lower behind the ledge, staring down through drifting smoke, while sweat ran cold across his back. "What is that?" he whispered. Callanheer did not answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed upon the great furnace below, horror slowly tightening every line of his face. "Not what?" he said at last. "Who?" The Nazgul spoke then in a harsh black tongue that echoed through the chamber like iron scraping against bone. Hallis could not understand the words, yet the effect upon the workers was immediate. Chains rattled as prisoners were dragged forward toward the furnace platforms. Several struggled weakly before guards beat them down with spear hafts and hooks. Daenor's jaw tightened. No more waiting. Lethariel seized his arm before he could rise. "And die uselessly," she hissed. "There are too many." The dwarf glared toward the prisoners below. "Those are my people chained beside orcs and slaves. And if we rush in now, they remain chained forever," Hallis said quietly. Daenor looked ready to argue further, but another sound interrupted them. From deep within the furnace tower came a sudden metallic shriek, followed by the hiss of escaping steam. The crimson glow intensified again, spreading outward across the iron surface like veins of living fire. Then one of the prisoners screamed The company watched in stunned silence as two guards forced a captive man onto a raised platform directly before the furnace gates. He appeared half dead already from labor and beatings, barely able to stand beneath the chains binding his wrists. The Nazgul approached him slowly, while all others in the chamber withdrew several paces. The ringwraith touched the prisoner's forehead with one pale hand. At once the man convulsed violently. Black smoke poured from his mouth and eyes, while the furnace tower roared louder in answer. Hallis gripped the stone ledge hard enough to tear skin from his knuckles. The prisoner's screams became something inhuman, stretched and broken by agony beyond endurance. Then suddenly the sound stopped. The body collapsed lifeless upon the platform, and the furnace blazed brighter. Calanhir turned away sharply, face pale with sickness. "They are feeding it." Daenor stared at him. "Feeding it what?" "Fear, pain, perhaps even spirit itself." Calanhir swallowed hard. The old texts warned that certain furnaces built in Morgoth's time were bound to darker powers than mere flame. Heat alone could not sustain them. Hallis felt his stomach tighten. "You mean the forge lives?" "In a manner," Calanhir answered quietly. "Corrupted things often do." Below them, workers resumed their labor, while the Nazgul drifted through the cavern like a shadow given shape. Wherever it passed, men lowered their heads and labored faster. The prisoners nearest the furnace seemed weakest of all. Some barely moved beneath their chains, others stared blankly at nothing, hollow-eyed and broken. Lithariel leaned close beside Hallis. "Look there." Near the far side of the cavern, partly hidden behind towering stacks of iron, a massive chain mechanism descended into darkness below the furnace floor. Great wheels turned slowly beside it, while steam hissed from deep cracks in the stone. "The support pillars," Calanhir whispered. "The vents must lie beneath that platform." Daenor studied the machinery grimly. "If we reach those chains, perhaps we can bring the whole cursed chamber down." "And how do we cross a cavern filled with soldiers?" Hallis asked. Before anyone could answer, a sudden commotion erupted near the prisoner lines below. One captive had collapsed entirely, unable to rise despite the guards striking him repeatedly. Hallis saw at once, from the broad shoulders and braided beard, that the prisoner was one of the dwarves. Daenor moved before thought could stop him. With a furious roar, he surged from hiding and leaped onto the lower scaffold beneath the ledge. His axe crashed into the skull of the nearest orc before the creature even understood danger had come. The second guard turned in shock, just as Daenor buried the axe blade deep into its chest. "Daenor!" Hallis shouted. Too late. The cavern exploded into chaos. Horns blared instantly through the smoke, while Easterling soldiers rushed toward the scaffold from every direction. Prisoners cried out in confusion as Daenor hacked through chains binding the fallen dwarf. "Move, fool!" he bellowed, "unless you prefer dying here." Hallis cursed beneath his breath and drew his sword. "No choice now." They descended together into the furnace chamber. Lithariel's arrows struck first, dropping two Easterlings racing toward Daenor across the platforms. Hallis met another guard head-on beside a narrow bridge spanning molten trenches. Heat slammed into him like a furnace blast, while sparks swirled thickly through the air. The Easterling lunged savagely with a curved spear, but Hallis caught the shaft aside and drove his sword beneath the man's ribs. Nearby, Calanhir knelt beside the chained prisoners, working desperately to free them while chaos spread through the cavern. More guards poured toward them from the outer platforms. Daenor fought like a maddened bear among the scaffolds, his axe splitting shields and limbs alike. The rescued dwarf stumbled weakly behind him, clutching a stolen hammer. Blood streamed down Daenor's forehead from a spear cut above one eye, yet he barely seemed to notice. "Hallas!" he roared over the thunder of the furnaces. "The chains!" Hallas saw what the dwarf meant at once. The massive wheel mechanism near the furnace base remained almost unguarded amid the confusion. If they could collapse the supports beneath the forge. A terrible shriek ripped across the chamber. The Nazgul had turned toward them. Everything seemed to freeze beneath that sound. Men dropped weapons and clutched at their ears while prisoners cowered against the stone. Hallas felt icy terror lance through his body so sharply that his sword nearly slipped from numb fingers. Across the cavern, the ringwraith glided toward them through smoke and firelight, black robes untouched by sparks or heat. Lethariel loosed an arrow directly at its hooded face. The shaft burst into ash before striking. The Nazgul raised one pale hand. At once the furnace tower roared violently, and molten fire exploded upward through iron grates high above the chamber. Burning metal rained across the platforms. Soldiers screamed as flames consumed them where they stood. One scaffold collapsed entirely into the molten trenches below. "Move!" Hallas shouted. The company scattered across the chamber, while fire spread wildly among the wooden walkways. Hallas seized one of the massive support chains near the wheel mechanism and hacked at its fastening bolts with all his strength. Beside him, Daenor swung his axe against another support pillar, sparks bursting from black iron with every blow. "It's holding!" the dwarf snarled. Callanhur staggered toward them through the smoke, face streaked with ash. "Stand back!" His hands ignited again with terrible silver fire. The flames burst outward, not like ordinary heat, but like liquid light, pouring across the support chains in blinding waves. Iron screamed. The massive bolts holding the wheel assembly glowed white-hot for one heartbeat before shattering apart entirely. The cavern shook. Far below the furnace floor came a deep, cracking sound. Workers and soldiers alike began shouting in panic as the great chain mechanism lurched violently sideways. One enormous wheel tore loose from its mountings and crashed through the lower platforms, crushing men and scaffolding beneath it. Steam erupted from ruptured pipes, while molten rock surged upward through widening fractures in the stone. "It's working," Hallas shouted. Then the Nazgul reached them. Cold swept across the furnace chamber, so suddenly that flames nearest the ringwraith dimmed and hissed. The creature moved through smoke like death itself, silent now save for the dreadful emptiness pressing outward from beneath its hood. Hallas raised his sword instinctively, though terror clawed at every thought within him. The Nazgul pointed toward Callanhur. "You," it whispered. The voice sounded wrong. Too many voices speaking together beneath one breath. Callanhur froze where he stood. The ringwraith drifted closer. "The fire remembers you." Hallas stepped between them before fear could stop him. "Get to the pillars!" he shouted toward the others. The Nazgul turned slowly toward him. For one impossible heartbeat, Hallas glimpsed only darkness beneath the hood. Endless darkness filled with distant burning shapes. His strength nearly failed entirely beneath that gaze. Then steel rang sharply beside him. Lethariel's blades flashed as she struck at the ringwraith from behind. Though her weapons passed strangely through the black robes, the attack distracted the creature long enough for Hallas to recover. Daenor seized the moment instantly. With a roar, he hurled his axe directly into the final support chain, anchoring the furnace platform. The chain snapped. A thunderous crack split the chamber. The entire furnace tower lurched sideways. Screams erupted across Angruin as the cavern floor began collapsing beneath the weight of the great forge. Molten fire burst upward through widening fissures, while scaffolds and bridges crashed into the abyss below. Hallis grabbed Calanhear's arm and dragged him toward the western tunnels as stone rained from the ceiling around them. Behind them, the Nazgul shrieked in fury. And from within the collapsing furnace, something enormous began to wake. The mountain came apart around them. Stone split open with deafening cracks, while molten fire surged through the widening fractures beneath the furnace chamber. Hallis stumbled across a collapsing scaffold as sparks and burning debris rained from above. Behind him, prisoners screamed in terror, scattering through smoke-choked tunnels while soldiers fought desperately to escape the falling cavern. Entire sections of the forge were breaking away now, crashing downward into blazing pits far below. The roar of collapsing stone drowned almost every other sound. Yet beneath it all, deeper and far more terrible, something else continued rising from the furnace depths. "Hurry!" Lothariel shouted. She led a cluster of freed prisoners toward the western passages, while arrows hissed around them from surviving Easterling guards. One struck the stone beside Hallis, hard enough to spray shards across his face. He turned and cut down the attacker with a savage slash, born more from desperation than skill. There was no battle order anymore. Angruin had become pure chaos. Orcs trampled one another in blind panic, while steam burst from shattered pipes across the platforms. Daenor limped beside Hallis, gripping a stolen hammer in one hand. His axe was gone, lost somewhere near the collapsing supports, and blood streamed steadily from the cut above his eye. Yet the dwarf still moved with stubborn fury. "The whole cursed mountain's coming down," he barked. "Not fast enough," Calanhear answered. Hallis glanced sharply toward him. The healer stared back towards the great furnace with growing horror carved across his ash-streaked face. Then Hallis heard it too. A heartbeat. Slow. Massive. Echoing through the stone beneath their feet. Boom. The sound rolled through the cavern like distant thunder. Workers and guards alike froze momentarily despite the chaos around them. Another heartbeat followed, stronger this time, accompanied by a deep grinding noise rising from the collapsing furnace tower itself. The Nazgul stood unmoving amid the destruction near the center platforms. Black robes whipped violently through the heat and smoke, while the ringwraith raised both pale hands towards the furnace. Flames surged upward around it in towering spirals. "No," Calanhear whispered. "It's trying to wake it fully." The furnace split open. Black iron burst outward in a shower of molten fragments as something immense forced itself upward from within the collapsing tower. Hallis caught only glimpses at first through smoke and fire. A shape larger than any troll, wrapped in burning chains and blackened iron plates, fused directly into flesh. One enormous arm clawed free from the furnace ruins, scattering molten stone aside like water. Then the creature rose. It towered above the chamber, half hidden within smoke and falling debris, its skin cracked open with veins of fire glowing beneath. Iron spikes jutted from its shoulders and spine, as though hammered there by ancient smiths long ago. The thing's head resembled neither man nor beast fully, but some twisted union of both, with burning eyes sunk deep within a face scarred by heat beyond imagining. Daenor stopped dead. By Durin's beard, A fire drake? Hallis breathed. No, Callanhear said hoarsely. Something older. The creature dragged itself free from the ruined furnace with a roar that shook the mountain. Chains snapped from its limbs as it rose to full height amid collapsing stone. Molten rock streamed from its body onto the platforms below, where soldiers fled screaming before it. The Nazgul remained standing directly before the beast, untouched by falling debris. Then the creature bowed its head. Not in submission. Recognition. The ring wraith pointed toward the escaping prisoners and company alike. At once the burning giant turned its blazing eyes upon them. "Run!" Hallis shouted. The beast struck the cavern floor with one massive fist. The stone exploded. A wave of fire burst outward across the platforms, consuming men and scaffolds instantly. Hallis threw himself behind a fallen support beam as heat rolled over him, fierce enough to scorch leather and hair. Nearby, an Easterling soldier vanished screaming into the flames. Another stumbled, burning into the molten trenches below. Lethariel fired arrow after arrow toward the creature while retreating through the smoke. None slowed it. The shafts burned away before touching its skin. "We cannot fight that," she shouted. "No," Callanhear answered grimly, "but perhaps we can bury it." The western tunnels were collapsing rapidly now. Great cracks spread along the ceilings, while chunks of stone crashed down around the fleeing prisoners. Hallis seized a frightened northern captive and dragged him away from a falling scaffold moments before it shattered against the ground. "This way!" Daenor roared. The dwarf led them toward a lower passage branching beneath the main furnace chamber. Heat blasted upward from below, while steam poured thickly through the narrow tunnel mouths. Hallis realized suddenly where Daenor was heading. The vents. "Aye," Daenor growled. "If the mountain falls into the vents themselves, maybe even that thing stays buried." Behind them, the creature crashed through the collapsing forge in pursuit. Every step shook the cavern violently. Its burning roar echoed through the tunnels like the voice of the furnace itself, awakened after ages of sleep. The company and surviving prisoners plunged into the lower passages, while chaos consumed Angruin above them. Hallis coughed hard against smoke, thickening the air with every breath. The tunnels here were older than the upper chambers, rougher and carved directly into black volcanic stone. Crimson light pulsed upward through cracks in the floor beneath their boots. Callanhear stumbled suddenly beside the wall. Hallis caught his arm. "Can you walk?" The healer nodded weakly, though sweat poured down his face. "The fire. It's growing stronger." "What does that mean?" Callanhear looked back toward the tunnels behind them, where distant roars still thundered. "It means the creature is tied to the forge itself. Every furnace vent feeding Angruin feeds it also." Daenor cursed harshly ahead. "Then we collapse the whole damned mountain." The passage opened abruptly onto a vast chasm deep beneath the forge. Hallis stopped at the edge in disbelief. Far below churned a river of molten fire stretching into darkness beyond sight. Massive stone pillars rose from the lava like the roots of a mountain, supporting the chambers above. Ancient chains, thicker than ship masts, hung across the abyss, connecting narrow walkways carved into the cliff walls. Heat slammed into them with suffocating force. "The deep vents," Callanhear whispered. Even Daenor looked shaken. No forge should reach this far below the earth. A tremendous crash thundered through the tunnels behind them. The creature was coming. "Across!" Hallis shouted. The prisoners began scrambling over the narrow chains and walkways, spanning the abyss. Several nearly fell as the mountain shook violently beneath them. Hallas helped an injured dwarf onto the nearest bridge, while Lothariel guarded the rear passage bow in hand. Then the Nazgul emerged from the smoke behind them. The ring wraith floated silently above the shattered stones, black robes untouched by ash or heat. Behind it came the burning creature, stooping low beneath the tunnel ceilings, molten light pouring from cracks in its skin. Fear swept across the chasm instantly. Prisoners froze mid-crossing. One man lost his footing entirely and vanished screaming into the fire below. The Nazgul pointed toward Calanhir once more. "You cannot flee the flame," it hissed. Calanhir stepped forward slowly, despite Hallas grabbing his arm. The healer's face had changed. Beneath the sweat and ash, his skin now seemed faintly luminous, silver light flickering beneath the surface, like fire trapped behind glass. "I know you," the Nazgul whispered. Daenor stared sharply at him. "What is it talking about?" Calanhir did not answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed upon the ringwraith ahead. "When Eregion fell," he said quietly, "some among the smiths tried to preserve their knowledge before Sauron seized it. My father was one of them." He swallowed hard. "He bound certain crafts into bloodlines, believing they might one day resist the enemy." Hallas frowned. "What crafts?" "The fire itself." The truth struck all of them at once. Lothariel lowered her bow slightly. "You carry it within you." "Yes," Calanhir whispered. "And Angruin recognizes its own." The Nazgul stretched one pale hand outward. "Come willingly," it said. "The forge will obey you. Sauron promised greatness once before. It may yet be yours." For one terrible heartbeat, Hallas saw uncertainty flicker across Calanhir's face. The burning creature roared behind the ringwraith, shaking molten chains across its body. The mountain trembled harder now. Cracks spread rapidly across the stone pillars, supporting the abyss bridges. Daenor stepped beside Calanhir, gripping his hammer tightly. "Do not listen to it, lad." Calanhir looked toward the fleeing prisoners, struggling across the chasm, then toward the collapsing tunnels behind the creature, where rivers of fire already surged upward through widening fractures. "There is only one way to bury Angruin completely," he said quietly. Hallas understood before the others did. "No." Calanhir turned toward him with deep sorrow in his eyes. "If the vents collapse while the forge still burns, the fire may survive beneath the mountain." Silver flame flickered faintly across his trembling hands. "But if the furnace heart is extinguished first, you'll die," Hallas said. "Perhaps." A faint sad smile touched Calanhir's face. "Perhaps not alone." The Nazgul shrieked suddenly and surged forward across the bridge. Lothariel's arrows flew instantly, while Hallas and Daenor charged to meet the attack. Steel rang against unseen darkness. Cold crashed over them like winter wind as the ringwraith drove forward with unnatural strength. Behind it, the burning giant forced itself into the chasm chamber, molten claws ripping stone apart with every step. And Calanhir walked alone toward the fire. The heat within the chasm became unbearable as Calanhir descended the broken walkway toward the roots of the furnace vents. Sweat poured from every face while molten light surged upward beneath the stone bridges in violent waves. Above them, the mountain groaned like a wounded beast nearing death. Cracks spread rapidly through the pillars spanning the abyss, raining fragments of burning rock into the lava far below. Yet through all the chaos, Hallis saw only Calanhir, walking steadily toward the heart of the fire, silver light growing brighter around his hands with every step. "Calanhir!" he shouted. The healer did not turn back. The Nazgul shrieked with sudden fury and drove forward across the bridge. Hallis met it head-on beside the shattered chains, while freezing terror crashed through his body, hard enough to steal breath from his lungs. His sword struck the ringwraith's shadowed form with a burst of sparks, though the blade felt as though it had cut through ice and smoke together. Beside him, Daenor swung his hammer with all the strength of his broad shoulders, forcing the creature backward a single step across the trembling bridge. "Go!" the dwarf roared toward Calanhir. "We'll hold the wraith." Lithariel's arrows flashed past them like silver streaks through the smoke. Though they could not truly wound the Nazgul, each shot slowed it enough for Hallis and Daenor to keep their footing against the creature's relentless advance. Frost spread beneath the ringwraith's feet, despite the furnace heat, while black robes writhed unnaturally around its form. Behind it, the burning giant entered the chasm fully. The creature's head nearly scraped the cavern ceiling as it moved onto the stone platforms above the lava river. Every step cracked the ancient foundations supporting the abyss. Molten fire poured from its jaws as it roared toward Calanhir, descending below. The healer finally stopped upon a narrow platform extending over the heart of the vents themselves. Hallis could barely see him now through smoke and blazing light. Beneath that platform churned the furnace source of Ungruin, a vast whirlpool of molten fire sinking deep into the roots of the mountain. Calanhir raised both hands. Silver flame erupted around him. Not violent like before upon the bridge, but radiant and terrible in its purity. The fire spread outward across the stone platform in glowing veins that pushed back smoke and darkness alike. Even the molten river below seemed to recoil from its touch. The Nazgul screamed. "You cannot master it!" the ringwraith shrieked. Calanhir's voice echoed faintly upward through the roaring chasm. "No, but I can end it." The burning creature charged. Stone exploded beneath its weight as it lunged toward the lower platform where Calanhir stood alone before the furnace heart. Hallis tried to break past the Nazgul to reach him, but freezing darkness slammed into him like a wall. He crashed hard against the broken bridge stones while pain shot through his ribs. Daenor roared in fury and hurled his hammer directly into the ringwraith's chest. The weapon passed partly through the black robes before striking something solid beneath with a sound like cracking bone. The Nazgul staggered backward for the first time. "Move, Ranger!" Daenor bellowed. Hallis surged to his feet and sprinted down the collapsing bridge toward Calanhir. Behind him, Lithariel continued firing relentlessly, while prisoners fled farther into the western tunnels beyond the chasm. The mountain shook so violently now that entire sections of ceiling were collapsing into the lava below. Ahead, the burning giant reached the lower platform. The creature raised one molten arm high above Calanhir, and the healer stepped directly into the furnace fire. Silver flame swallowed him whole. For one impossible heartbeat, all sound ceased. Then light exploded through Ungruin. It burst upward from the vents in a towering pillar, bright enough to blind. Hallis threw an arm across his eyes as silver fire raced through every crack and tunnel of the mountain, like lightning through stone. The burning giant reeled backward, roaring in agony, while the molten veins across its body shattered apart beneath the radiance pouring from below. The Nazgul screamed again. This time the sound carried fear. The silver fire spread across the abyss floor and surged upward through the broken furnace shafts above. Hallis glimpsed the forge chamber far overhead, collapsing entirely as ancient supports failed beneath the force of the blast. Rivers of molten rock erupted through shattered walls. The very mountain seemed to split open from within. Then Calanhear's voice rose through the fire. Not shouting, singing. The words were in an older tongue than Hallis knew, filled with grief and strange beauty that cut through the roar of destruction itself. The silver flames answered the song, twisting upward around the burning creature now trapped above the vents. Chains fused into its flesh, glowed white-hot, before snapping apart one by one. The giant staggered blindly toward the abyss edge and fell. Its roar faded downward into the molten depths far below, before vanishing completely beneath the thunder of collapsing stone. Hallis reached the lower platform at last. Calanhear still stood within the center of the silver fire, though his form had become almost impossible to see clearly through the radiance. Cracks spread rapidly beneath his feet, while the furnace vents imploded around him in violent bursts of steam and flame. "Come back!" Hallis shouted. Calanhear looked toward him then. For a brief moment, the fire dimmed enough for Hallis to see his face clearly once more. The healer smiled faintly, despite the destruction surrounding him. "The fire in our veins was never meant to rule," he said softly, "only to endure." The platform beneath him collapsed. Silver fire erupted upward one final time as Calanhear vanished into the furnace depths below. The mountain began dying all at once. "Hallis!" Lothariel's voice echoed through the smoke above. "Now!" He ran. The chasm bridge behind him shattered moments after he crossed it, plunging into the lava river beneath. Daenor seized Hallis by the arm and dragged him toward the western tunnels, while the Nazgul shrieked somewhere within the collapsing darkness behind them. Yet even the ringwraith's cries were growing weaker now, drowned beneath the ruin consuming Angruin entirely. The company and surviving prisoners fled through tunnels breaking apart around them. Heat chased them like a living storm, while molten fire burst through the walls in violent floods. Hallis stumbled repeatedly across falling stone, half blinded by smoke and exhaustion. Somewhere behind them, the ancient furnaces of Morgoth were collapsing into their own depths at last. At the final tunnel mouth, they burst out into the freezing night air, just as the mountainside exploded behind them. Fire tore upward through the peaks in towering columns, visible for miles across the northern wastes. Black smoke rolled into the sky, while avalanches thundered down every slope surrounding the valley. The fortress of Angruin collapsed inward upon itself, swallowed by falling stone and rivers of molten rock pouring from the shattered mountain. The survivors ran until the ground itself ceased trembling beneath their feet. Only then did they stop. Dawn was beginning far to the east. Pale grey light crept slowly across the snow-covered ridges, while smoke drifted upward from the ruins behind them. Where Angruin had once stood, only a broken scar remained upon the mountainside. Fire still glowed faintly beneath the rubble, but the great furnace was gone. Daenor stood breathing heavily beside the others, soot and blood blackening his face beneath the cold morning light. At length, he removed his gloves slowly and stared toward the ruined valley in silence. "He saved us all," Hallis said quietly. The dwarf nodded once. "Aye." Lothariel lowered her hood against the bitter wind sweeping across the mountains. "The Nazgul?" Hallis looked back toward the smoking ruins. No shadow moved there now. No black rider emerged from the destruction. Buried, he answered. Though deep within himself, he wondered if such creatures could ever truly die. The freed prisoners are gathered silently nearby, exhausted and wounded, yet alive. Among them stood the dwarves, rescued from the forge, their grim faces lit by the pale colors of dawn. One bowed his head deeply toward Dino. Khazad-dûm will remember this, he said. Dana glanced once more toward the shattered mountain. Then remember him too. The wind carried ash across the snow as morning slowly spread over the northern wastes. Hallas pulled his cloak tighter against the cold and stared eastward, where distant shadows still lay upon the lands beyond Mordor. The war against Sauron was far from ended. More darkness would come, more fires would awaken before the end. Yet Angruin was gone. And beneath the grief settling heavily within him, Hallas felt something else enduring quietly against the long shadow of fear. Hope.
Так, привітик. З вами автор. Ну що, хочу поділитись думкою. Самі розумієте, що історія написана не просто так, вона має мету чогось вас навчити. Наприклад, тут в мене була така думка, що найнебезпечніша сила – це не та, що приходить із темряви, а та, яку людина починає виправдовувати всередині себе. Мені здається, в таких історіях завжди боляче не через битви чи втрати, а через момент, коли хтось вирішує, що заради правильного результату можна навіть поступитися собою. Не просто, а реально сильно. Спочатку зовсім трошки ти йдеш, але далі вже медаль просто стирається. Мабуть, саме тому справжня мудрість виглядає не як сила йти вперед, а як здатність вчасно сказати собі «ні». Навіть коли світ шепоче тобі так, як в реальному житті. У реальному житті це завжди трапляється. Не завжди трапляється так тихо, не у великих війнах, а у дрібних рішеннях, які поступово змінюють нас. Іноді людина рятує в собі світло не гучними вчинками, а тим, що не дозволяє темряві стати для неї звичною. Мабуть, це і є найважливіша боротьба, і, чесно кажучи, вона ніколи не закінчиться повністю. Я думаю, що завжди треба буде боротися з собою, тому радий, що слухали мене, що глянули моє відео. Ставимо вподобайки, підписуємося, можемо писати в коментах, про що б ви хотіли почути наступну історію. Я постараюсь зробити це в своєму стилі, класно для вас подати. Так що всіх радий бачити в себе на каналі, бачити в переглядах. Я радий, що ви є, навіть в невеличкій кількості, але ми робимо свою справу. Тому до зустрічі!